Lecture 3, The Law of Diminishing Returns. The law of diminishing returns is one of the most powerful concepts in economics. Briefly stated, the law says each additional unit of a variable input that we add to our fixed inputs contributes less to production than the previous units of that variable input. Now you'll notice there's a little phrase up there at the beginning that says after a certain level of output. That's sort of a qualifier that I'll explain a little bit more later on. But the basic idea is as you add more variable inputs, each additional unit is less productive. Okay, before we go on, I want to take a step back and introduce a new concept, the idea of the marginal unit of anything. We're going to use this idea of the marginal a lot during the course. It's going to be particularly important when we talk about profit maximization next week. But anyway, here's the idea of the marginal unit. The marginal unit is the last one. So if we eat 10 hot dogs, the marginal hot dog is the 10th hot dog. If we have a factory workforce, the marginal worker is the last one hired. If we apply fertilizer to our farm field, the marginal pound of fertilizer is the last one applied. Now notice that when we talk about something being the marginal unit of an input, we're automatically in the short run talking about variable inputs because the fixed input stays fixed. So this idea of the marginal wouldn't make any sense as long as it's a truly fixed input. Okay, so here's some other ways of stating the law of diminishing returns. Law of diminishing returns says that as we add more variable inputs to our stock of fixed inputs, the contribution of each additional unit of the input decreases, or the contribution to output of the marginal unit of the variable input is always decreasing. I kind of left off that bit about the fixed input in there, but that's the basic idea. The marginal unit's productivity is always decreasing. Okay, a few points about the law of diminishing returns. Notice that the law of diminishing returns only applies in the short run because we're talking about situations where we're adding additional variable inputs to the fixed input. Another important assumption in the law of diminishing returns is that as we're adding these additional variable inputs, the technology that we're using isn't changed. So the technology stays fixed as well. So we can't change the technology as we add more variable inputs to somehow make those inputs more productive. Everything stays the same. And finally, this idea of that we tack on at the beginning, the qualifier that at some point diminishing returns kicks in, means that when we start at zero, we may be able to get a really big contribution from adding a few units of the variable input. But at some point, that contribution will start to level off. Okay, here's an example of the law of diminishing returns that you've all witnessed many times in going out and getting something to eat. The Subway restaurant, Subway the sandwich chain. Over on the left there, we have a customer showing up at the counter, and there are people working behind the counter. It's important to understand the counter is the fixed input, and the workers are the variable inputs. Like over on the right, we've got the counter again, and the workers that are behind it. Fixed input, the counter, variable input, the workers. Okay, so this guy shows up at the sandwich counter, and he's going to order his sandwich. What if there were only one worker there? Well, that worker, as you know if you've ever been to a Subway, would have to take the order, pull out the bread, slice the bread, put the meat on the bread, walk over, put the condiments on the bread and meat, then walk over again, wrap up the sandwich, cut it, put it in a bag, and then take the customer's money. And then they could go back and serve another customer. Now, what if you added a second worker to this production process? So the first worker could take the order, take out the bread, slice it, put the meat on, and then put the condiments on, and then pass it to the second worker, who would wrap it up, put it in the bag, and take the customer's money. Meanwhile, that first worker is already back and serving another customer. So you can see you get a big productivity kick from adding the second worker. Many, many more customers can be served per hour than with only one worker. If you add a third worker, the first worker takes the bread out, puts the meat on, passes it to the second worker who puts the condiments on, who passes it to the third worker who wraps it up and takes the customer's money. Adding the third worker contributed to productivity, but not as much as that second worker did. We get a big bang for the buck from the second worker, but not as much from the third. All right, add a fourth worker. First worker, bread and meat. Second worker, condiments. Third worker, wrap it up and put it in the bag. Fourth worker, take the money. Again, you could serve more customers per hour, but you didn't get a big increase in the number of customers you could serve from adding the fourth worker. If you add a fifth worker to this fixed input, the counter, remember, is a fixed size. What's that person going to do? They're going to have a hard time finding a task to perform. They're probably just getting into everybody else's way. So they may actually lower the productivity of the sandwich making operation. So the fifth worker definitely contributes less to production than each preceding worker. So that's a demonstration of the law of diminishing returns. After that second worker, that's the after a certain point that I was talking about, the third worker and the fourth worker contribute to additional production, but each one contributes a little less, and the fifth worker may actually push you down in terms of um, his contribution to production. So where do diminishing returns come from? Well, the Subway sandwich shop demonstrates one of the most important areas that causes diminishing returns, especially regarding labor. Adding more workers allows for specialization of labor, which is one of the bases for the modern assembly line. But at a certain point, if you keep trying to add more and more people to the assembly line to that fixed input, they're not going to contribute as much. So you can get an increase at the beginning from labor specialization. But at a certain point, you're going to get less and less contribution from each additional worker. By the way, the guy up at the top there, that's Henry Ford, who founded Ford Motor Company, and he also invented the assembly line for producing automobiles, which was a big contribution to the American automotive industry. Another factor that causes the law of diminishing returns is input quality. When you start production, you're probably going to use the highest quality inputs or the ones that are best suited to your production process. And as you produce more and more, you're going to have to pull in units of the input, like the labor or other inputs, that aren't quite as well suited to whatever you're producing. Here's an example. A startup wants to hire engineers with exactly the right skills for its new technology. But as it expands output, it may not be able to find workers with those specialized skills anymore. So it hires engineers who have good skills but have to learn the specialized skills on the job and therefore are less productive. So in a way, there's been a decline in quality of the variable input, the engineers, as you hired more and more. So each one contributes less. So in addition to the fact that the labor specialization gains start dropping off after a certain point, you also have to deal with the fact that you essentially have lower quality inputs. You'll see in the next few lectures that the law of diminishing returns drives a lot of our economic theory about production and costs. And because of its impact on costs, it has a big impact on profitability and the way firms maximize their profits.